Thank you for using this on-demand session. It is sponsored by the Student Life Studies Department at Texas A&M University. We hope it gives you more insight into assessment in student affairs. This session is about rubrics, a tool that can be used for assessment. Rubrics are a convenient way to convey expectations for performance and structure feedback in a uniform and concise way. Please use the following statements to guide your attention. At the end of the session, you will be able to describe what a rubric is and articulate why you use rubrics. A rubric is a tool that can be used to assess criteria such as knowledge, skills, competencies, or disposition across levels in a scale. Some rubrics can be a list of items for planning an event or an educational experience. Rubrics can also be a way to communicate specific expectations about tasks. Rubrics organize criteria to systematically determine whether the outcome was met. Why would you use rubrics? You can use a rubric to describe how a criterion is being measured, quantify the level at which a criterion is measured, provide consistency in assessment, and to give feedback at the individual level for each individual being assessed and at the aggregate for the initiative, program, or event being assessed. Rubrics can deliver timely and in-depth feedback because it is a standard for assessing many items with one tool. Rubrics can promote collaboration by team members in a department or a committee. The use of rubrics can make professional practice effective and efficient. There are 4 basic steps to develop a rubric, and each requires that you define the results to be measured, for example, a student's critical thinking skills, criteria that will be evaluated, how you're going to measure the level of whether the criterion has been achieved, and describe each level of performance for each criterion. There are several types of rubrics. The most commonly used rubrics are the holistic and the analytic. There may be other terms for these types of rubrics. A holistic rubric tends to be for assessing a snapshot of the achievement and for an overall judgment of the criterion. An analytic rubric is used for when you want more details about what is being assessed. Analytic rubrics can use separate scales for each competency or outcome. Analytic rubrics assist users in identifying strengths and weaknesses or opportunities for improvement in what is being assessed. In general, you want to use analytic rubrics to give detailed feedback, particularly for assessing complicated skills or artistic performances. Also, analytic rubrics are a great way to communicate performance expectations to students and for students to perform self-assessment of understanding or performance according to your standards. In designing an analytic rubric, as illustrated in this slide, it uses a matrix or table format of rows and columns. The criteria is located in the rows from criterion 1 to 3. Each criterion should describe an aspect of the expected outcome. The rating scale, located at the top of the table across the first row as headings of columns 1 to 4, correspond to the standards or scale to assess the levels of achievement. The intersection between criterion in the rows and scale in the columns are the descriptors. Descriptors provide the detailed description of the criterion outcome against an achievement, growth, or standard level. This slide shows an example of a rubric to assess the critical thinking skill levels of students leaders from the Student Leader Learning Outcomes or SLO project. You can notice that on the left column, the criteria has been stated. In this case, there are only 2 criterion. The rubric has 3-level rating scale, from novice to intermediate to advanced. Each cell contains the description for each criterion at each level of the scale. This rubric provides a systematic and standard way to assess a student leader on whether the student's critical thinking skills are at a novice, intermediate, or advanced level, when it comes to identifying a problem. The criteria in an analytic rubric define and describe what participants of an experience should remember, understand, apply, or evaluate. Bloom's taxonomy is commonly used to address learning domains. As per Bloom's taxonomy, you want to use action verbs in describing the outcome. For example, students combine ideas to form a new idea. The operative word, combine, is an action verb. You want to align the outcomes in your rubric as defined in each criterion with those of your unit, department, division, or the university. Map the rubric's outcome to your professional practice, for example, the value rubrics from the Association of American Colleges and Universities. When developing a rubric, you want to collaborate with colleagues and stakeholders, particularly students. Their feedback can improve your rubric. Lastly, but very important, make sure that the outcomes are formulated in a way that they can be measured. The rubric in this slide is an example of a rubric mapping to practice. This rubric maps learning outcomes throughout the co-curricular programs to the standards for learning and development outcomes of the Council for the Advancement of Standards in Higher Education, or CAS. There are many models that can guide you when writing outcomes for a rubric. The Student Life Studies Department has a preference for the ABCD model because it is simple and a best practice standard. The model has 4 components, each identified by a letter, where A stands for audience. This means that you have to keep in mind who is the experience intended for. B is for behavior, and it stands for what observable and measurable behavior the learner is expected to attain. C is for condition, which refers to the context or situation in which the experience is intended to take place, and D is for degree, or expected level of learning performance after the experience. When designing a rubric, ensure that the criteria can be measured. For instance, the IAL value rubric in this slide from the Association of American Colleges and Universities has a 4-level scale. At each level, the rubric describes how to measure the criterion. A rubric could also be used to assess whether program outcomes were met, how satisfied or dissatisfied were program participants, and to identify areas that need improvement. There are numerous types of scales to assess outcomes. This slide shows examples of scales. For example, if you are interested in the satisfaction level of participants of an educational experience or program, you can use the satisfaction-dissatisfaction scale. As the TAMU staff, you can use Qualtrics, a web-based survey software, to create rubrics. It offers a variety of scale options. An important step in the process of developing a rubric is to test it to assess whether it measures and communicates what it is intended to measure and communicate. There are various ways to test a rubric as listed in the slide. You could use a meta-rubric, which is a rubric to assess a rubric. You also want to consult with your peers and other experts to review your rubric, particularly to examine its validity or whether the rubric measures what it is intended to measure. Make sure to ask stakeholders who will be assessed using the rubric, like your students, for their opinion about whether the rubric is clear to them. This can give you feedback on whether the rubric communicates well what it is intended to assess with it. You can also use statistical software programs like SPSS for testing your rubric. For instance, you can perform analysis such as exploratory factor analysis to group your items into factors and find the right reliability, whether results are consistent of the criterion being measured. This type of analysis can inform you about whether or not the rubric consistently measures what it is intended to measure. This is an example of a meta-rubric to assess a rubric's basic elements and its overall purpose. It is a checklist type of rubric with a binary scale. It guides the rubric user to check on whether certain criteria are present in the rubric by check marking yes or no questions. Data collection is a systematic and standardized way to collect data about a criterion or outcome from observations and artifacts. For example, you can use a rubric to collect data from reviews of student portfolios or evaluation of written reflections. Rubrics can also use to collect data from administrative units about student organizations or program reviews. The data collected needs to be analyzed. Analysis is the process of summarizing and finding patterns in the data that could guide decisions and actions. There are various types of data analysis. Descriptive analysis provides a summary of values, averages, and spread of the data. Correlation analysis for understanding relationship between variables. Inferential analysis to examine differences between groups to infer about a population or to track changes over time. And prediction analysis, which is used to understand how a variable or combination of variables affect an outcome or outcomes. You use data analysis results to provide evidence on whether or not outcomes were met. Detail the level at which outcomes were met at the time of data collection. Understand the impact of the initiative, program experience, or satisfaction on the intended audience. Tell the story to the stakeholders. Provide evidence to maintain, change, or eliminate an initiative or program. Make evidence-based recommendations, and to modify the rubric. In concluding this session about rubrics, I want to go back to the guiding statements for self-assessment. Take a minute to reflect on the following statements. In your own words, can you describe what a rubric is? Can you articulate why would you use a rubric? This is a list of references used to develop this session about rubrics. Thank you for using the learning session sponsored by the Student Life Studies Department at Texas A&M University. If you have any questions, please come by 222 Caldas Building, call us at 979-862-5624, or email us at sls@tamu.edu. We will be happy to assist you.